Dear friends of astronomy and of life, this is actually my 50th YouTube video and it's time to celebrate a little bit. So today's topic will be, is complex life unlikely? Which is inspired by a book. I'm going to show you that book later, and I'm trying to discuss the background of this a little bit. So let's start with complex life on Earth, because that's the only knowledge we have so far, and we tend to extrapolate what we find on Earth into space. I'll discuss this in the end, if this is a good idea or not. What requirements does complex life need? Actually, this is too pretentious. I'm not able to answer this question, but it should be raised. And the whole video is a little bit programmatic. So many things I mentioned just on passing by, I will have to discuss in later videos. So it opens up many doors, but doesn't conclusively answer any questions anyway. And in the end, I'll give a little summary and synthesis. I hope you are still there by then, because some important things will be just touched, but for later. So this is a slide out of the first presentation or video I made about life in space, and this more or less bolsters the view that life started very early in the history of the Earth, so roughly at 3.8 billion years before now, which is just 800 million years after the Earth started. Whereas the more complex life is towards the end. And of course we tend to consider ourselves as the most complex life forms, which is an unproven hypothesis. But yeah, here are the fact is, here are the vertebrates, and all the other life forms or animal forms are more or less summarized as invertebrates. But my point is, look at them more closely, because we learn it at school about vertebrates, but almost nothing about invertebrates. So that's also stuff for later. I will give a second slide that kind of taps exactly the same thing, but it looks quite different, which is that one. I also gave you that in one of my videos before. They are linked in the description. Here again, the scale is not to scale, because half of the scale is the last 500 million years. So there was much more time before that. Not the way you should plot a scale as we learn in statistics. But here we look more at the Proterozoic. Why is the Proterozoic important? We tend to think, yes, Ediacan is really early, nothing happened there in terms of life. Although here we can read origin of life, ? And then the Archean suggests Archean, not very developed. Here there were some microorganisms that made methane, which is one of the early biomarkers that we think we could find on other planets going around other suns. Microfossils, stromatolites. Maybe we'll also talk about stromatolites at some stage. They have been found in Western Australia. A very fascinating story. So there's already quite a bit of life in these eons. But for the Proterozoic, we definitely should look at that. Here there's a mark. First, complex life. What does complex life mean? Are you only complex when you're running around? Or has it to do with the number of cells in an organism? Or has it to do with a number of fundamentally different cells in an organism? Has it to do with the mechanisms used for replication, for controlling the environment, things like that? I mean, we do a very bad job controlling our environment, which I've just mentioned in a recent video on mass extinctions. I recommend you to look at that too, although it's a bit political, but still interesting. Here there are more concrete mentionings. Trace fossils of multicellular eukaryotes. So biology teaches us that eukaryotes had possibilities that prokaryotes didn't. Has being complex to do with being eukaryotes? And there's the Ediacan period mentioned here. We will also have to look at that later. So somehow complex life started in the middle of the Proterozoic, or maybe even towards the beginning of the Proterozoic, which means complex life existed much longer than shown in this plot. And then there was the Cambrian explosion, and the Cambrian explosion more or less set the stage for everything that happened after that. So there was diversification, there were lots of species dying out after that, but the Cambrian explosion more or less defined what is possible in terms of life on Earth. Quite a big thing to say, but I think it's not wrong to say so. That's my point of be cautious with defining complex life. Depending on how you define it, you will find science earlier or later. And the second thing of caution is be critical towards fossils, because it's easy to find hard fossils but hard to find soft fossils. And maybe complex life started with soft tissue. It's possible. Especially for animals. Then this is my central slide of this presentation, which is again a bit programmatic. I have almost no sources, and I will try to give them in later videos. So in the Proterozoic, I just showed you eukaryotes started. What does eukaryotes mean? They contain a proper cell core. Then I never quite grasped what this means for complex life, but it has also the simplest view of that is eukaryotes were able to integrate whole bacteria as organelles, which for animal life, the most striking example is the mitochondria, but equally important for the plant life are the chloroplasts. And both of them happened in this time. This is just a side issue. Sexual reproduction, the meiosis in eukaryotes, when did that start? And from when on was it used on a regular basis? Often sexual and non-sexual production happens in the same species. Some can choose. And there were also predecessors of sexual reproduction in bacteria, which meant they just exchanged some material. Whereas in eukaryotes, the process is much more sophisticated. Why did complex animals start so much later then? This is the big question. Again, here it doesn't look as extreme, but here, really towards the end, it started with fish and reptiles and mammals and birds. The point is the oxygen. First, the Earth needed measurable amounts of oxygen in the atmosphere, and for that, plants had to develop. There were plants making oxygen very early, but to be efficient, the first efficient ones were the cyanobacteria. And they integrated chloroplasts, and they mastered that. They increased the efficiency a lot. And we learned that around 1.85 billion years ago, cyanobacteria came, and later freshwater algae came, and they were a cornerstone for the developments of plants. And this was 1 billion years ago. We'll have to talk about them in later videos. So once the oxygen levels were high enough, then there was an explosion of new possibilities in the animal kingdom. So what we see is a sort of seeding. We had eukaryotes using mitochondria, but they were not very efficient. And they became efficient only when oxygen levels were high enough, and the oxygen levels were made by the plants. And then the animals profited a lot and started to thrive. I mean, the complex animals, which made it possible for them to run around, because before that, with low oxygen levels, the advantage of having mitochondria was not very large, basically. So this is a good example of a system. You have animals, you have plants, they seem to develop independently, but still they profit from each other such a lot. I mean, at least in one direction. Animals profit from the plants, so they had to wait for the plants to be more efficient, which happened. The book that gave me the idea of this presentation was this one, by Ward and Brownlee. And they argue for scarcity of complex life in the universe. And their basic point is, look at the conditions on Earth that were enabled complex life on Earth and how late that happened. And they extrapolate that to all the other planets out there and say we need an Earth that is just right. The right amounts of water, not too little, not too much. Plate tectonics to guarantee a stable environment. I mean, plate tectonics are not stable, but the conditions they produce are stable because you get rid of the CO2, these kind of things. You produce shallow waters that were probably important for life, this kind of thing. Stable amounts of land area, which is a very interesting feature of plate tectonics. The oceanic crusts get destroyed all the time, but the land crust stays the same in amount, although it reforms all the time, but the amount is basically the same from the beginning. And they also cite the large moon and how stabilizing it is for the Earth climate. So, is this a good way of arguing? I don't think so. Although I like this book a lot, it's a standard, a cornerstone of the discussion of life in the universe. But this conclusion, based on one observation and even based on a maybe biased view of this one observation, is probably influenced by beliefs, I think. First, complex life started a lot earlier than people are thinking. This way of you are complex only if leaving fossils has to be revised. We have to look at also at soft animals. Then it runs our way or it doesn't run view. It's very short-sighted. Complex life can look very different to our complex life, and it can also have a very different background to our complex life. What I would certainly say is that sexual reproduction is a very important point, and it accelerated the adaptation massively. This is probably not an argument for the making of complex life, but it's certainly an argument for the stability of complex life. So for simple life, it has been argued that it was probably made several times before being stable. And for the complex life, it could have had disadvantage, not that it was easy to make, but once it was there, it stayed stable because of mechanisms like sexual reproduction. Because complex life is slow, that's clearly the case, but it is a lot faster now. It has sexual reproduction and meiosis than it was in the beginning, before having that. I have to admit that the question what is needed for complex life is not answered yet. I mean, it's not even scratched on the surface. And probably we'll be able to answer that question only when we have several examples and not only one example. What I would suspect is that a critical amount of simple life is needed. And once there is thriving simple life, and maybe there are difficult conditions, there can be an advantage to be complex, and this can look very different in different environments. But once there is an advantage of complexity, it will find its way. I don't think it's a sort of godlike experience that something magical happens with a simple life and then it becomes complex. But once complexity is an advantage, it will develop, and will develop fast, as we have seen with this integration of mitochondria. All that our ancestors had to do is basically to eat them, take them in through the membrane, and then the complexity increased a lot because we had the organelles that were actually bacteria before that. And here is a little point, but a maybe important point. My educated guess is a very important requirement for complex life is active transport of supplies. We will look at this later, probably. Animals and plants had very different ways of these active transports. In plants, it came a lot earlier, but the plants paid by being stationary. The active transport in higher plants has to do with woodification. You can observe this if you're out in nature, like blackberries or whatever. First they're green and then they woodify and become brown. Why do they do that? There are certainly advantages of staying green. You can grow flowers much easier if you're green, this kind of thing. But once you have longer stems and need more complex supply, you have to woodify. This was the solution of the plants, but once they woodified, they were not able to move anymore. Of course, they have also roots, and the roots are hard to displace, but the woodification is the final stop for walking around for the plants. But it helps them to pump. We will look at this hopefully later in one of the 950 videos coming after the first 50 videos. For animals, the solution came more gradual, which you can see in fish. They have hearts to propel the blood, but they don't have a proper system to pump the blood, which came only in reptiles. That's what I mean when I say it was a gradual solution. But there were large fish, which is kind of an enigma. But a heart and a proper supply, proper way of pumping blood or supplies through the body is certainly an important point for complex life. There are other important points like growing a nervous system, but there is complicated life with quite simple nervous systems, but certainly nervous systems are a boost for complex life. So folks, I tried to make a short video because there are only 7 slides, but it still came out long again. I would like to conclude that presentation with an image of a very complex plant to remind you that you should not look only at animals if you want to understand life on Earth. So stay curious and keep looking up. Thanks for the attention.